Hello, welcome to School of Ministry. Today's module is Philosophy of Ministry, Part 2. Philosophy of Ministry, Part 2. In Philosophy of Ministry, Part 1 or Lesson 1, we discussed some basic concepts about God. God is a spirit, He's infinite, He's omnipotent, He's omniscient, He's immutable. And we talk about the being of God. Today, what I would like to do is to talk about the definition of God. I'm using for today's lesson, the Westminster Catechism. Many years ago, a group of scholars penned or they wrote a definition of God. And in my opinion, and many scholars, they agree that this is one of the best or the better definition or more complete, comprehensive definitions of God. And when I talk about definitions of God, is that we can't define God totally or put a boundary around Him because He's infinite. But the definition that which separates Him and make Him distinct so we can understand who He is through the Westminster Catechism. They really did well. The Westminster Confession, rather, about who God is. So we're going to discuss that today and then two other ideas for today's lesson, all right? So let me read it first. It says, God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, unchanging. God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging in His being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. All right? It seemed like a lot, right? So we're going to break it down and I'll make it simple. That's my job. Have no fear. I'm gifted to take complicated ideas and make it as simple as possible so we can grasp it. And the way is to make it, present it in a way in which we can easily remember it. All right. So try not to, some things you may have to memorize, but if you understand it, you don't have to really remember it. You just know it. All right. So the first thing about in this confession is that God is. He is a spirit. All right. And then it talks about three aspects, which is amazing. That is good, amazing, concerning God. God is a spirit. I am a spirit too, but I'm a human spirit. All right. But God is a spirit and He's infinite. I mean, there's no limit to Him. God is eternal. That means He has no beginning, no end. God transcends time. He exists out of time. Before time was, He is. And when time has ended, He will continue to be. So God has no beginning, He has no end. He's eternal. Now, there's a difference between something that is eternal and something that is everlasting. There's a distinction. An eternal being is he who has no beginning or any end. Something is everlasting if it has a beginning. If it has a beginning but no ending, it's everlasting. But eternal means no beginning, no end. God is not everlasting. Because to say that God is everlasting would signify that He would have a beginning. His kingdom is everlasting. It has a beginning but no end. But His being is eternal. That means He has no beginning, He has no end. So God is infinite spirit, no limits. He is eternal and He's unchanging. That means He's immutable. All right. So three things we got to know this about God, about this spirit being. He's infinite, He's eternal, and He's unchanging in His being. Right. And then we talk about, so there's three things. Okay. He's infinite, He's eternal, He's unchanging. And now there are three things about they list now 8 qualities of God. It's not comprehensive. We can't know everything about God, but from what we know about the Bible, they pick out 7 actually. All right. And the 7 qualities are His being, His wisdom, His power, His holiness, His justice, His goodness, and truth. Once again, there may be others, but from the scriptures, we can point out 7 so far. So let's go through the 7. The first one is his being, his wisdom, his power. That's 3. 4th is holiness. 5 is justice. 6 is goodness. You can write them down. And the 7 is truth. All right. So here's what connect it. There are 3 things about God, about his being. He's an infinite being. So let's talk his first one, his being, right? The being of God is an infinite being. There's no limit to his being. He's an eternal being, no beginning, no end. And his being is unchangeable. So each of these 7 aspects of God, we can describe it in the 3 qualities that we listed in the beginning. Okay, let's take the wisdom of God now. The second one aspect. In the wisdom of God is infinite. The wisdom of God is eternal. The wisdom of God is unchangeable. The third aspect is power of God. The power of God is infinite. The power of God is eternal. It doesn't begin or end. There's no limit to it, the power of God. The power of God is unchangeable. The holiness of God is infinite. It's infinitely holy. And by the way, we worship him for his holiness. The holiness of God is eternal. He's not less holy at some point in time and more holy. He's always been holy. And it's unchangeable. The justice of God is infinite. The justice of God is eternal. The justice of God is unchangeable. The goodness of God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. And the truth of God is infinite. The truth of God is eternal and unchangeable. So the 3 aspects: infinite, eternal, unchangeable. Infinite, eternal, unchangeable. And it applies to the 7 characteristics of God that we know. 7 characteristics of God. And each of these 7 characteristics of God has these 3 qualities. The 7 characteristics of God is his being, his wisdom, his power, his holiness, his justice, his goodness, and his truth. Those are the 7 characteristics. And to each of these 7 characteristics, we have these qualities. His being, his wisdom, his power, etc. They are all infinite. And that's the first quality. His being, his wisdom, his power, his holiness, they're all eternal. And they're all unchangeable. So in this confession, we say that God is a spirit. If one can memorize it, but we say God is a spirit, is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. Those are the descriptive elements of these attributes or characteristics. So his being, in his wisdom, God is wise, is a being wisdom. He has power in his holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. All right. So that's the definition of God. It's good to memorize it. You could write down, make notes, or go back over and go through them in terms of a good definition of how you describe God. And when we understand this, then we can come to some conclusion. We can come to some truth of who God is. All right. So God, and when we consider that, we know that God is self-existent. Everything that God needs to be God is within himself. God doesn't need anything. We're going to talk about that more later on. God is, I need air, I need water, I need food, I need my blood, I need medicine, I need air, I need light. But God needs nothing. Everything that he needs to be God is within himself. And he's absolute sovereign. That means he rules. Because he is the cause of everything, and because he made everything, he has priority. He's preeminent. He has the right. He has the right, the ownership to rule, and to rule as he chooses. No one can stop him or contradict him, because nobody helped him or advised him or assisted him when he made the universe. No one else was there. He did it on his own. Nobody advised him, nobody helped him, nobody gave him ideas. He did it on his own, and he did it according to his will. So God is absolute sovereign. He rules, and nobody can stop his authority. Nobody can resist his authority. Nobody can call his authority into question or oppose it. He does anything that he wants and everything that he wants. He's absolute ruler. He's not answerable to anybody. He's not answerable to anybody. And anything that, and by the way, let me just add this. Anything that God does in terms of man, he does it out of, we call it divine condescension. It's his grace. He condescends. He brings himself or manifests himself to our level, condescension, so that we can bless us and he can be gracious unto us. If he reveals himself, he condescends to us. When it comes to earth, he condescends to us. To listen to our prayers, it's through his grace. He condescends to us. He's too high for us to reach him. He's too mighty for us to grasp him. He's too exalted for us to even be in his presence. But he condescends to us so that we can have access to him. So when we pray to him, when we understand him, when he manifests himself on earth, when he became a man, it's because God, out of his grace, condescends himself to our level. It doesn't mean he brings himself down, but he manifests himself to a certain level that we can understand him and relate to him. We're not equal to God. He's far above us. Condescension. So he's absolute sovereign, okay? And he does everything as he pleases. All right? And he upholds everything by the power of his word, the universe. And without God, the universe would not be or would not continue to exist. No one advised him. So God does as he pleases, and he does everything as he wills. All right? Because he's God. And he's this infinite spirit. Okay? There's no limitation. So I just want to finish this this lesson by talking about 5 things that you won't find in God. That's not in God. And the reason I'm bringing up these 5 things is that I hear preachers, when you hear preachers preach, and I see many ministers make the mistakes in the reference to God concerning these 5 years. And when they say these things, it means that they have not been taught. They have not been, they're not ready yet, they're not mature, and they're unlearned in terms of ministry. You know, and so I bring up these 5 things about God that we should realize they're never in God. Number 1, there is no contradiction in God. Absolutely none. There is no contradiction in God. God cannot contradict himself. All right? And anything that is contradictory is impossible. For example, God is truth. So God cannot be true and a lie at the same time. Truth and lies are contradiction. God cannot be true and lie at the same time. He's totally truth. So there's no contradiction in God. There's no sin in God. God is holy. He cannot be evil and good at the same time. So there's no contradiction in God. We are contradictory ourselves. But and by the way, contradiction is impossible. And you're not required to believe anything that's contradictory. Anything that's contradictory, it's impossible. All right, it's impossible for light to be dark and dark to be light. That's contradictory, and it's impossible. And by the way, you are not required to believe anything that's contradictory, and anything that's contradictory is a lie. So there's no contradiction in God. Absolutely not. There is no limitation to God. Secondly, there's no limitation to God. That means you can't limit God. God does as he pleases, and God will condescend himself, but he cannot be limited. He's infinite. All right. The third one I want to talk about is, there's no contradiction in God, there's limitation in God, is that there's no necessity in God. God does nothing out of necessity. God doesn't have to do anything. There's no need for him to do anything. When he died on the cross, there's no need for him. And many times you hear preachers say, well, God has to do this, and because he loves man, he didn't have to love man. He has to do this, or he has to answer prayer, or he has to do. God doesn't have to do anything. There's nothing that is necessary for God to do. There's no necessity in God. God does nothing out of necessity. God doesn't do anything because he has to do it. Anything that God does is because he chooses to do it out of his will. Because it pleases him. He does it out of his grace, out of his nature. So there's nothing that God has to do because he needs to do it, or it's necessary for him to do it. And many times say, well, God, well, in order for this to happen, God has to do this, or God has to, in order to save man, he had to become flesh, or he had to suffer, or whatever. No, there's no necessity. He does it out of his will, out of his grace. And so it's necessary only because it's his will. The only necessity is because of its will. When it's God's will, it becomes necessary. You follow what I'm saying? It looks necessary to us. But necessity does not precede the will of God. Got it, right? God's will doesn't follow necessity. Necessity follows the will of God. All right? So there's nothing that is necessary that God has to do. There's nothing that is necessary that precedes his will. All right? It's necessary for me to pay my bills, or else there are consequences. If I don't do it, there are consequences. If I don't pay my bill, if I don't shower, if I don't eat, there are consequences. So necessity and consequences are tied. If there's, because I want us the consequences, it's necessary for me to do this in order to avert a consequence. God's not worried about consequences as what we are. Who's gonna hold him consequential? You know, he can't. So God does nothing out of necessity. And so when I think of the consequences, it's necessary for me. It's necessary for me to breathe, to stay alive. But God does everything out of his will. Let me give you an illustration. It's necessary for me to pay my bills, or my light bill will shut off. But let us say, no, this, just for illustration, God doesn't pay his bill. Light's still on. There is no, nobody can hold him consequential. He changes the consequences. He is the source of consequence. So it's not necessary for him to do anything. Let me give you an illustration. Because he's sovereign and he does as he will. Good illustration. If somebody is the boss of a company and is owner of the company and is a CEO, is a top guy, it's not necessary for him to come in at 9 o'clock like you. He comes in whenever he wants to. Who's going to hold him accountable? He comes in because he wants to come in, and he feel, whatever. But, it's a limited illustration, but he doesn't have to come in and punch in the time or report to the supervisor like you. So there is absolutely no necessity in God. All right. The other thing about God is that there is no urgency in God. God doesn't dwell in time. It's urgent for me, once again, pay my bill, pay it on time. And if I have a plane to catch, I got to hurry, or else a plane will leave me. So I do things out of urgency. There's an urgency. God doesn't come according to our timetable. He does as he pleases in his own time, according to his will. There is no urgency in God. That's why when you pray and deal with God, you got to realize God doesn't do anything out of urgency. God is never in a rush to do anything, or God is never stressed out over anything. No urgency in God. There is absolutely no urgency in God. There's no necessity in God. God doesn't do anything out of urgency. He does things according to his will, in his own time. And the other thing that is not in God is that there's no contingency in God. Contingency, let me give you an illustration. I planned this and I said, okay, if that doesn't work, I have plan B. Or if that doesn't work, then I could do this. I try something and, no. Whatever God wills, it must come to pass. God only have one plan and one plan alone. That means whatever God plans and desires and purposes, it must come to pass. There's no backup plan with God There's no plan B or plan C. There's no contingency. There's nothing say, okay, God, contingency means if this doesn't work, then I'm going to do this. No, God does not operate like that. God has one plan. As a matter of fact, history, the events of history, is merely an unfolding of the plan that God has from before the foundation of the world, and that God has before the earth was created. And all that is going to happen in the future is merely an unfolding of what God has planned. That means nothing takes God by surprise. He knows everything. There's nothing that takes God by surprise. There's no failure in God because he doesn't have a plan B. There's no failure in God. There's no backup plan in God. There's no say, okay, that doesn't work, or maybe he's going to try. Whatever God says or does is sure. It means whatever God has promised, whatever God has declared, whatever God says will come to pass, will surely come to pass. That means we can rely on his word. His word is trustworthy. His word is reliable. His person is trustworthy. And his person is reliable. So we need to understand that about God. All right. So let me just say this. It isn't a part of my notes, but it just popped into my head because there's no contingency in God. God is a God of promises. Wherever we encounter God, God often, the false gods are the gods of man. God always let people know I'm distinguished from your crazy false god, which is not God's anyhow, because I speak. He's a God who speaks. And when he speaks, he gives commands, he gives instructions for life, and he gives promises. He gives promises. He promised to Adam in the garden, don't eat or else you're going to die. It's a negative promise. Or he promised the children of Israel, he promised us. The promise of God is a gospel. All right? The gospel is a promise of God. God is a God who makes promise. And we're believers because we not just believe in the being of God. But what makes us believers is not just believe that God exists. We believe what God has spoken. We believe the promises of God. And we are saved because we believe the promise of God. We are saved by the gospel because the gospel is the promise of God. And wherever God encounters man, or you encounter God, you're going to run into his promises. You cannot deal with God without dealing with his promises. And what makes us a believer, or you're a believer, you believe what God has said, believe his promises. And if for example, if I make a promise and you don't believe my promise, it means I don't trust your character. I believe that you're lying. I don't trust your competence. I don't trust your capacity. I don't trust your ability. But if you believe what I say, my promise, it means you're saying that I have the character to keep my word. And not only that, I have the competence, I have the ability to do everything that I promise. So when a person rejects the promise of God or what God has said, you're rejecting not just a promise, you're rejecting the character of God, the competence of God, the being of God. But when you have faith in God, you're saying that God, what you say will come to pass. I believe your word. You have the character to keep your word. You have the competence, the capacity to do everything that you said. And what makes us believers is that we believe the promises of God. Because there's no contingency in God. Whatever God says will certainly, definitely come to pass. All right? So that's the end of our lesson. I'll see you soon. God bless.